How far would a government go to get its way? That answer might vary considerably depending on your view of what's happened in the last 4 years or so. Would they kill knowingly? Would they poison their own people? Would they taint pure alcohol knowing full well that it would be bought and consumed? Well, you bet they would. During the era of Prohibition in the United States, the government took drastic and deadly measures to stop people from drinking. Their boldest strategy? Poisoning industrial alcohol that bootleggers were repurposing for consumption. This was an experiment that spiraled out of control. What started as an attempt to discourage illegal drinking ended in tragedy, with thousands of Americans dying, often horribly, from consuming tainted alcohol. And the worst part, the government knew what was happening, and they did it anyway. Prohibition was supposed to be a noble experiment, a way to curb the excesses of alcohol consumption and usher in a new era of public morality. But instead, it gave rise to organized crime, rampant corruption, and in one of its darkest chapters, a government willing to sacrifice lives in a desperate attempt to enforce the law. This is the story of how the US government poisoned moonshine, all in the name of law and order, and how that decision turned fatal for thousands of unsuspecting Americans. Prohibition, also known as the Noble Experiment, began in 1920 with the ratification of the 18th Amendment and the passing of the Volstead Act. The goal was simple: to eliminate the sale, production, and distribution of alcohol across the United States. It was believed that this would lower crime rates, reduce public intoxication, and improve the health and morality of the American public. And in theory, it sounded like a plan that could work. Cutting alcohol out of society and forcing the country into sobriety seemed like a good idea, but the reality was pretty different. What actually happened was that alcohol consumption didn't just continue, it thrived. The demand for liquor didn't disappear overnight simply because the government said it was illegal. Instead, people found ways to get their hands on it through an ever-growing black market. This was the era of bootleggers and speakeasies. Almost overnight, a whole underground economy sprang up dedicated to smuggling and selling alcohol. If anything, alcohol consumption became more widespread as people sought to outwit the law. This underground trade wasn't confined to American cities' back alleys. It was a national enterprise, feeding a public that wasn't ready to give up their drinks. Criminal empires like Al Capone's in Chicago flourished, making millions from smuggling alcohol and running speakeasies. Corruption spread throughout law enforcement, with officers and politicians bribed to look the other way. Crime rates, far from dropping, skyrocketed. And then came the moonshine, the homemade liquor people started brewing in their homes, barns, and basements. Moonshine wasn't regulated, often leading to dangerous batches that could blind or even kill those who drank it. But it was still cheaper and easier to make than the alcohol being sold in underground bars. Soon, moonshine became a staple of Prohibition-era drinking. But moonshine alone wasn't enough to meet demand. Bootleggers needed more alcohol to keep their operations going, and this is where the story takes a very, very dark turn. The answer they found was industrial alcohol. Legal, readily available, and incredibly dangerous if consumed. Used for cleaning supplies, fuels, and manufacturing, industrial alcohol could be cleaned up and sold as liquor. By the mid-1920s, bootleggers were stealing millions of gallons of industrial alcohol, redistilling it, and turning it into drinkable liquor. This was a problem the US government couldn't ignore. Faced with the unstoppable rise of illegal alcohol, they decided to fight back, not by shutting down the bootleggers, but by attacking their supply. And the method they chose would prove deadly. By the mid-1920s, it was clear that Prohibition wasn't working. Bootleggers were outsmarting law enforcement at every turn. Speakeasies were flourishing, and Americans continued drinking as though the 18th Amendment had never passed. Law enforcement was overwhelmed, and the government's attempts to curb illegal drinking were failing spectacularly. The US government, frustrated by its inability to control the flow of illegal alcohol, came up with a drastic plan. Starting in 1926, federal authorities instructed manufacturers to add toxic chemicals to industrial alcohol. The idea was simple. If bootleggers were going to steal industrial alcohol and turn it into liquor, the government would make it so dangerous that no one would dare drink it. They increased the levels of methanol, a highly toxic wood alcohol that can cause blindness and death, along with other chemicals like kerosene, chloroform, and acetone. These were not subtle poisons. Methanol, in particular, is incredibly lethal, even in small amounts. The government hoped that this would make the alcohol unappealing and stop people from drinking it. If the bootleggers couldn't turn industrial alcohol into something drinkable, the thinking went, they'd have no choice but to stop. But well, shock horror, that ain't what happened. The bootleggers, they didn't stop. Instead, they continued stealing and redistilling the industrial alcohol, assuming, or at least hoping, that their distilling process would remove the dangerous chemicals. But it didn't. People kept drinking the alcohol, now laced with lethal poisons, unaware of the danger they were in. Soon after the poisoning program began, people started dying. The first cases emerged in New York City, where hospitals saw a sudden influx of patients suffering from methanol poisoning. Many were blind or paralyzed, and others died within days of drinking the tainted alcohol. Doctors were horrified, not just by the symptoms, but by the sheer number of people affected. Methanol poisoning wasn't something they were used to seeing on such a massive scale, and the effects were devastating. Despite these early warning signs, the government didn't stop the program. Instead, they doubled down, increasing the amount of poison added to industrial alcohol in a desperate attempt to make it too dangerous to drink. The logic was cold but clear. If people kept drinking poisoned alcohol, it was their own fault for breaking the law. This was not just a scare tactic. The government knew people were dying, and they continued to poison the alcohol anyway. The thinking was that the deaths would serve as a deterrent, a grim warning to those who dared to defy prohibition. The poisoning of industrial alcohol quickly turned into a public health crisis. In 1926 alone, more than 400 people died in New York City from drinking poisoned alcohol, but that was merely the beginning. Over the next few years, the death toll skyrocketed as tainted alcohol spread across the country. By some estimates, as many as 10,000 people died as a direct result of the government's poisoning program. The effects of methanol were horrific. The symptoms of methanol poisoning are brutal. People suffer from intense nausea, vomiting, severe abdominal pain, and headaches. In many cases, it leads to blindness as the poison attacks the optic nerve. Those who survived often lived with permanent damage, including neurological impairments, blindness, or even paralysis. But for many, the poison was a death sentence. Methanol poisoning could kill within days, and there was no effective treatment at the time. Doctors were often powerless to stop the poison once it had entered the body. Victims would fall into a coma, and death often followed. The lucky ones, if you could call them that, would lose their sight, but at least they'd survive. In New York City, doctors were horrified by what they were seeing. They had dealt with alcohol-related illnesses before, but this was something entirely different. Dr. Charles Norris, the city's chief medical examiner, was one of the most vocal critics of the poisoning program. He called it legalized murder, and he wasn't alone. Norris and other public health officials tried to raise the alarm, but the government responded chillingly. Federal authorities continued to defend the program, arguing that the people dying were breaking the law by drinking illegal alcohol, so they were responsible for their deaths. In other words, the government had no intention of stopping the poisoning program. If anything, they saw it as an unfortunate but necessary side effect of enforcing prohibition. The public's response was pretty mixed. On the one hand, there was outrage at the idea that the government would knowingly poison its own citizens. On the other hand, there was a widespread sense of fatalism. People knew the risks, but for many, the lure of alcohol was more potent than the fear of death. Bootleggers weren't just selling to criminals, they were selling to everyday Americans who simply wanted a drink. These were not hardened outlaws, they were regular people who didn't believe the government had the right to tell them what they could or couldn't consume. The tragedy was that most people had no idea just how dangerous their drinks had become. Bootleggers often didn't care about the quality of their product, they were in it for the money, and if people got sick or if they died, it's just collateral damage. The government's poison wasn't advertised. People didn't know that the liquor they were buying had been tainted with lethal chemicals by their own government. As the death toll mounted, the ethics of the poisoning program came under increasing scrutiny. Journalists, doctors, and public health officials began speaking out more forcefully, accusing the government of crossing a moral line. Was it really worth it to enforce a law that no one wanted by killing people? In the late 1920s, it was clear that prohibition wasn't working. The poisoned alcohol was just one symptom of a broader crisis, a government that had lost control, a public that no longer trusted its leaders, and a law that was causing more harm than good. But despite the growing backlash, the poisonings continued until 1933, when prohibition was finally repealed. By the early 1930s, it was becoming increasingly clear that prohibition had failed. The crime rates it was supposed to reduce was skyrocketing. The public's disregard for the law was growing more brazen by the day, and the country was reeling from the unintended consequences of the alcohol ban, most notably the thousands of deaths caused by poisoned liquor. The government had tried to strong-arm the nation into sobriety, but all they had done was create a thriving black market and a national health crisis. And the figures here are astonishing. Before Prohibition, Americans drank around 9.8 liters, that's 2.6 gallons of alcohol per person annually, which dropped by 30% after the 18th Amendment was signed, but eventually rose again due to illegal activity and reached levels only just lower from where it started. Homicide rates increased from 5.6 per 100,000 people in 1919 to 10 per 100,000 people by 1933, partly due to the violent nature of the illegal alcohol trade. With little success, the government spent $300 million, that's around $5.6 billion today, on enforcing prohibition laws. At its peak, there were only about 1,500 federal agents dedicated to enforcing the law across the entire country, which partly explains how the illegal trade was allowed to run rampant. In terms of the economy, prohibition led to the closure of over 1,000 breweries and tens of thousands of distilleries. Over 200,000 jobs were lost in the alcohol industry, contributing to economic hardship, particularly during the Great Depression. Upon repeal, the alcohol industry quickly revitalized, providing jobs and generating tax revenue. By 1934, the tax on alcohol provided about $500 million, a whopping $11.7 billion in today's money annually for the federal government. Prohibition may have been a noble experiment, but its results were almost completely negligible and in many ways actually made things worse. Alcohol had taken a firm grip on society which it wasn't going to let go of anytime soon. In 1933, the country had simply had enough. Prohibition was repealed with the passage of the 21st Amendment, which overturned the 18th Amendment and finally brought the failed experiment to an end. The repeal was met with celebration across the country. Americans were tired of speakeasies, bootleggers, and the constant threat of poisoned alcohol. The alcohol ban had done nothing to reduce the desire for drinking, and its enforcement had led to more harm than good. But even as Prohibition ended, the damage had already been done. With as many as 10,000 Americans dead from drinking poisoned alcohol and many more left with lifelong disabilities, the government's poisoning program had become one of the darkest chapters in US public health history. The legacy of this experiment didn't just vanish with the repeal of Prohibition, it left a lasting mark on how Americans viewed their government, specifically the idea that the government could so easily justify endangering its own citizens in the name of law enforcement. After it ended, the federal government quietly stopped poisoning industrial alcohol. Today, these events are rarely discussed, but they remain among the most unsettling chapters in US history. How far would a government go? As far as it needed to control its people. Thanks for watching.